Alex walked down the empty street, his tired footsteps echoing in the cool evening air. He had just finished a long day at work and was eager to get home and relax. The city, usually full of noise, felt strangely quiet tonight. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. As he walked, he couldn't help but feel a bit weary. His mind was still on the stressful day he had at work, the endless meetings, and the pile of tasks that never seemed to end. All he wanted now was to get home, put his feet up, and forget about everything. Just as Alex was about to turn the corner, a police car pulled up beside him, its engine purring in the quiet night. Alex glanced over, expecting it to pass, but instead, the car came to a slow stop right next to him. The window rolled down, and a tall officer leaned out, eyeing Alex with a sharp, almost judgmental look. "What are you doing out here this late?" the officer asked, his tone cold and dismissive. Alex was caught off guard. He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just a guy trying to get home after a long day. But there was something about the officer's stare that made him feel small, like he was being judged without reason. "Just heading home," Alex replied, trying to keep his voice steady, but there was an edge of defensiveness in it. The officer scoffed, clearly not interested in Alex's explanation. "Heading home, huh? You sure don't look like it," he said, his eyes narrowing. "What, you think you can just walk around here like you own the place?" The officer's words stung, and Alex felt a flush of anger rise in his chest. He wasn't used to being spoken to like this. It was as if the officer was treating him like he didn't belong, like he was somehow less than him. But Alex kept his composure, not wanting to escalate things. "I'm just trying to get home," Alex repeated, his voice calm but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong." The officer smirked, leaning back in his seat. "Yeah, sure. I bet you haven't," he said sarcastically. "Just a guy out for a walk, right? No trouble here." He paused, his eyes scanning Alex from head to toe, as if he were inspecting some kind of criminal. "You know, people like you shouldn't be out this late. It's not safe." Alex felt his fists clench at his sides. "What do you mean, people like me?" he asked, his voice barely holding back the frustration bubbling inside him. The officer didn't miss a beat. "You know exactly what I mean," he said with a dismissive laugh. "People who don't have a place in this neighborhood. People who should be home, not out wandering around." The words hit Alex like a punch to the gut. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Was the officer really saying that he didn't belong here just because of how he looked or the fact that he was out so late? It didn't make any sense. But before Alex could respond, the officer waved his hand dismissively, as if he had already decided everything about him. "Yeah, whatever. Just keep moving. Don't want to see you hanging around here again," the officer said, his tone harsh and final. Alex stood there for a moment, shocked by the officer's rudeness. His heart was pounding, his mind racing. He hadn't expected this, not at all. He had just been walking home, minding his own business. But this officer had treated him like he was a criminal for no reason. Alex wanted to say something, to shout at him, to tell him how unfair this was. But he didn't. Instead, he turned and walked away, his head down, trying to hide the anger and embarrassment that threatened to boil over. As he walked, the words of the officer rang in his ears. "People like you." The phrase haunted him. What had he meant by that? Was it because he was young? Because he was dressed casually? Alex didn't know, but it didn't matter. The officer's words had left a bitter taste in his mouth. He could feel the humiliation creeping up on him, but he refused to let it show. He wasn't going to let some random cop make him feel small. The night air felt colder now, and Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He had done nothing to deserve that kind of treatment, but as he continued down the street, trying to push the encounter out of his mind, he couldn't help but wonder what it would have been like if he had stood up for himself. If he had said something to the officer, would things have turned out differently? Would the cop have backed down, or just gotten angrier? Alex shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He was overthinking it. He had to focus on getting home. He didn't want to let this encounter ruin his night. But deep down, he knew this wasn't something he could easily forget. It wasn't just the officer's words. It was the way he made Alex feel. Like he didn't matter. Like he wasn't worthy of respect. And that wasn't something Alex was going to let slide. He pushed the thought aside for now and quickened his pace, eager to leave the awkward encounter behind. But he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that somehow this wasn't over. Something about the officer's attitude had felt different, more personal, like he had judged Alex based on something deeper. But what? Only time would tell. The next day, Alex couldn't shake the encounter with the officer from his mind. His thoughts kept drifting back to that moment, how the officer had treated him, as if he were beneath him. It was still eating at him. Alex wasn't one to let things slide easily, but he also didn't want to escalate things. He tried to focus on his work, but the words "people like you" echoed in his head, making him feel more and more upset as the day went on. As the evening approached, Alex found himself walking the same route home. He tried to brush off the thoughts of the cop, but they kept creeping back in. The unfairness of it all gnawed at him, and he couldn't stop thinking about how he had just let the officer get away with it. He wasn't the type of person who let insults go unchallenged, but this situation felt different. What if he had stood up to the officer? What if he had said something to make him realize how wrong he was? His thoughts were interrupted as he turned the corner, just a few steps away from where the confrontation had happened. He stopped dead in his tracks. There, parked at the same spot, was the police car again. The officer was standing by it, talking to another cop, his back turned to Alex. The anger that had been simmering inside Alex all day suddenly flared up again. He couldn't let it go any longer. Without thinking, he marched over to the officer, his heart pounding in his chest. As he approached, the officer glanced over his shoulder, noticing Alex's determined stride. The officer's eyes narrowed in recognition, but he didn't say anything, clearly not expecting anything more than a quiet pass-by. Alex stopped just a few feet away from the officer and took a deep breath. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Alex started, his voice steady but filled with emotion. The officer seemed to sense something different in Alex's tone, his casual stance shifting slightly as he faced him fully. The officer let out a half-laugh, clearly not expecting Alex to approach him again. "Oh, it's you," he said, his voice dripping with mock surprise. "What, you gonna lecture me now?" Alex didn't back down. "I don't need to lecture you," he replied, his voice firm. "But you need to understand something. You don't get to treat people like that. You don't get to judge someone based on how they look or because they're out late. That's not your place." The officer smirked, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "Oh, so now you want to tell me how to do my job?" "No," Alex said, shaking his head. "I'm telling you to treat people with respect. No one deserves to be made to feel small for no reason. You don't get to make someone feel like they don't belong." For a moment, there was silence between them. The officer looked at Alex, his eyes searching his face, and for a brief second, the cocky confidence he had shown before faltered. He didn't say anything, but his eyes told a different story, one of uncertainty and maybe even regret. Alex stood there, watching him, waiting for some kind of acknowledgement. The officer didn't respond, but Alex could feel the tension in the air. It was a tense moment, but Alex wasn't going to back down this time. After a few seconds of silence, he turned and walked away, but not without one final glance back. He had stood up for himself, and for the first time since their encounter, he felt a sense of relief wash over him. Maybe he hadn't won anything in that moment, but he had taken a stand, and that felt like a small victory. As Alex walked away, his thoughts shifted again. The officer might have felt something for a moment, but Alex didn't know if it would last. What would the officer do next? Would he change his behavior? Or was this just a temporary blip in his arrogance? Alex couldn't be sure, but he was about to find out. The days ahead would reveal more than he expected. You said. The following day, Alex received an unexpected phone call. It was from his manager at work, someone he had only just met a few weeks ago. The call was brief but unexpected. It was good news. Alex had just been promoted to a position in the company's executive team. He had been given a leadership role in a department that was vital to the company's future. The promotion was a big deal. Alex hadn't seen it coming, but it was a chance to make a real impact. As the word settled in, Alex felt a rush of excitement and nerves. This was the moment he had been working toward for years. The phone call ended with congratulations, and Alex sat in stunned silence. He was happy, but the thought of how much everything was about to change left him in a daze. There was one thing he didn't know: how much this promotion would affect his life in ways he couldn't yet understand. That night, as Alex sat in his apartment, his mind kept going back to the officer. His rude words, his smug attitude, the way he had treated Alex like he didn't belong. For a moment, Alex was lost in thought. The officer had embarrassed him, humiliated him without cause, and yet here he was, being promoted to a position of power. What did that say about fate? About the people who judged others? Alex hadn't been in the officer's shoes, but he now had the ability to shape how people like that were treated. It made him feel a sense of power, but also responsibility. The phone rang again. This time, it was a colleague from work. "Hey Alex, there's a meeting tomorrow, a department briefing. You're going to need to meet with the team." Alex nodded, his mind still distracted by the call from his manager. "Okay, I'll be there," Alex replied, even though his thoughts were still racing. It wasn't until he hung up the phone that he remembered something important. The officer from the street. He was part of the department Alex was now leading. Alex was stunned for a second. Could it really be the same officer? The one who had mocked him, who had made him feel worthless? It didn't seem possible, but he couldn't shake the feeling. He knew that he would soon find out, as the department was about to meet, and he was now the one in charge. The revelation hit Alex like a wave. The very officer who had humiliated him was now someone he was responsible for. Was it fate, or was it simply a coincidence? Either way, it didn't matter. Alex was now in control. The tables had turned, and he was about to find out how much the officer's arrogance would cost him. With a deep breath, Alex stood up, ready to face whatever was coming. The officer's actions had been uncalled for, but now, Alex had the power to make sure he wouldn't get away with them. It was time to see how the officer would react when he found out who Alex truly was. Would the officer be humble, or would his arrogance continue even when Alex was his boss? The suspense was unbearable. Tomorrow would be the moment everything changed. You said. The next day arrived quickly, and Alex could hardly focus on anything other than the upcoming meeting. His mind raced with thoughts of the officer. What would his reaction be when he walked into the room and saw Alex standing there, in charge? The uncertainty left Alex feeling on edge. He had never been in a position like this before. He was used to being just another employee, but now he was the one calling the shots. As Alex walked into the conference room, he was greeted by the usual faces, colleagues, assistants, and a few new faces he had yet to meet. His heart raced, but he held his composure. He had prepared for this meeting, reviewed the department's plans, and made sure he was ready for anything. But as he looked around the room, his gaze landed on a familiar figure standing by the coffee machine. It was the officer, the same one who had humiliated him on the street. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. The officer stood there with a coffee cup in his hand, not noticing Alex's presence. He was dressed in his uniform, the same cocky attitude lingering in the way he held himself. Alex's heart skipped a beat. He could hardly believe this was happening. How was it possible that the officer he had crossed paths with just a day ago was now part of his team? Alex took a deep breath and forced himself to walk confidently into the room. He kept his head high, focusing on the task at hand. The officer still hadn't noticed him as Alex set down his bag and began making small talk with the others. It wasn't until the officer turned around that their eyes met. There was a flicker of recognition on the officer's face, a split second of confusion, before he quickly masked it with a forced smile. The officer's expression shifted as he slowly walked over, his steps unsure now, his earlier arrogance replaced with something more cautious. "Ah, Alex," the officer said, his voice faltering slightly. "Didn't know you were here for the meeting." His smile was tight, forced. It was obvious he hadn't yet put two and two together. Alex could see the tension in the officer's shoulders, the way he shifted his weight nervously, trying to play it cool. "No, I'll be leading it," Alex said, his voice calm but firm. "We're going to be working together now, starting with this meeting." The officer blinked, his jaw tightening as the realization hit him. His face went pale, and his eyes quickly flicked between Alex's calm expression and the others in the room. It only took a moment, but in that moment, the officer's entire demeanor changed. The cocky attitude was gone, replaced by uncertainty and discomfort. The confidence he had shown the night before was nowhere to be found. "Wait, you're?" the officer stammered, his voice almost a whisper now. "You're the one from last night." Alex didn't say anything immediately. He just nodded, his eyes locking onto the officer's as the realization sunk in. The officer's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and shame. He had clearly underestimated Alex, and now, standing here in the room with his new boss, he had nowhere to hide. The room grew quiet as the officer seemed to struggle for words. I didn't know," he said finally, his voice almost pleading. "I had no idea you were. I didn't mean to." His words trailed off, his face reddening. Alex looked around at the others in the room, who were now watching the exchange with curious glances. The officer's discomfort was palpable, and for a moment, Alex felt a sense of power that he had never experienced before. It wasn't about revenge. It was about showing that actions had consequences. "I'm sure you didn't," Alex said coolly, the words coming out steady and controlled. "But now you do. And I expect everyone here to work as a team, with respect. No more jokes, no more disrespect." His eyes locked onto the officer's, and the message was clear. The officer nodded quickly, swallowing hard, but he didn't say anything else. He seemed to shrink back slightly, as if the weight of the moment was too much for him. The room fell into an uneasy silence for a second, but Alex didn't let the tension throw him off course. "All right," Alex said, breaking the silence. "Let's get started. We've got a lot to cover today." The officer, still clearly rattled, quietly took his seat. The meeting continued as planned, but the dynamic in the room had shifted. The officer no longer held any power. Alex did. And though it wasn't the confrontation Alex had expected, the change in the officer was enough. It wasn't about public humiliation. It was about realizing that respect couldn't be demanded through intimidation or arrogance. It had to be earned, and in that moment, Alex had earned something the officer would never forget: his respect. "You said." The days following the meeting were tense but telling. The officer, whose name was now revealed to be Officer Harris, kept his distance. It wasn't that he was actively avoiding Alex, but there was a noticeable shift in his behavior. Where once he had been confident and dismissive, now he was cautious, respectful even. Alex noticed the way Harris greeted him each day, a quick nod or a polite good morning, where there had once been snide remarks and arrogance. Alex had never expected an apology, nor did he think one was truly necessary. The power shift had already been made, but something unexpected happened at the end of the week. It was late on a Friday afternoon, just before the office was about to close. Alex was wrapping up some final reports when he heard a knock on his office door. He looked up to find Officer Harris standing there, looking uncharacteristically uncomfortable. The officer was standing with his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes not quite meeting Alex. For a brief moment, there was silence. "Alex," Officer Harris began, his voice hesitant. "Can I speak with you for a minute?" Alex put his pen down and motioned for him to come in. "Of course. Harris, what's up?" Harris stepped into the room but didn't sit down. He stood there for a moment, collecting his thoughts before speaking again. I just wanted to say something," he said slowly, his tone more subdued than Alex had ever heard it. "I want to apologize for the way I treated you the other night. It was wrong. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I realized that I let my position go to my head. I assumed things about you that weren't true, and I was completely out of line." Alex was taken aback by the sincerity in Harris's voice. He had never expected an apology, but here it was, genuine and unforced. It wasn't easy for Harris to admit his mistakes, and Alex could tell that it had taken him a lot to come forward. "I was rude," Harris continued, his eyes finally meeting Alex's, "and I should have never made you feel like you didn't belong. I'm sorry for that, and I'm sorry for underestimating you." Alex sat back in his chair, processing the unexpected apology. There was something almost humbling about the way Harris was speaking. The officer was no longer the confident figure he had once been. Instead, there was vulnerability in his words, an acknowledgement that he had messed up. And in that moment, Alex realized that this was the kind of growth he had wanted to see, not just from Harris, but from everyone. "Thank you, Harris," Alex said, his voice calm but filled with understanding. "I appreciate that. I know it's not always easy to admit when you're wrong, but it means a lot that you did." Harris nodded, his face softening. "I never thought I'd be in a position where I'd have to apologize to someone like you, but here we are." Alex smiled faintly. "We all make mistakes, Harris. What matters is how we learn from them, and it looks like you're learning." There was a brief silence between them before Harris spoke again. "I'm still learning," he said quietly, "but I'm going to try to do better. I promise." Alex stood up and extended his hand. "Well, let's make sure we both learn from this. We've got work to do." Harris shook Alex's hand firmly, his eyes reflecting a newfound respect. The tension that had once existed between them seemed to dissolve in that moment. What had begun as a humiliating experience for Alex had transformed into a chance for growth and understanding. For both of them. As Harris left the office, Alex felt a strange sense of relief. He hadn't expected this outcome when he had first crossed paths with the officer. But sometimes people surprised you, and sometimes those surprises could lead to something even more valuable than just a shift in power. They could lead to real change. And for the first time in a long while, Alex felt like the world was starting to make a little more sense. "You said." The weeks passed, and the change in Officer Harris wasn't the only thing Alex noticed. The entire department seemed to be shifting in a way that Alex hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about power anymore. It was about building respect, trust, and a team that worked together, not because they had to, but because they genuinely respected each other. Harris, who had once been a figure of authority that everyone feared, now worked quietly alongside his colleagues. His previous arrogance had been replaced with a humility that made the entire department more cohesive. He wasn't the only one who had changed, though. The atmosphere in the office had become more positive, more collaborative. People were starting to speak openly, share ideas, and support one another in ways they hadn't before. Alex wasn't blind to the fact that change took time, and he knew the road ahead would still have its challenges. But for the first time, he felt like the team was on the right path. Even the smaller moments, people giving each other a nod of approval, helping each other with tasks, and standing up for one another, proved to Alex that things were improving. One morning, after a long meeting that had gone better than expected, Alex found himself walking through the office, stopping to chat with his colleagues. It was a regular part of his routine, but today it felt different. People were actually engaging with him, asking questions, giving feedback, and laughing together. It was the kind of environment Alex had always envisioned, but never thought he would experience in such a short time. As he passed by Harris's desk, the officer looked up and gave him a nod. It wasn't the stiff, uncomfortable nod from earlier. This one was genuine. Alex smiled back. "I've been thinking," Harris said, catching Alex before he walked away. "You were right about the respect thing. It's not just about the work we do. It's about how we treat each other. And I've seen a big difference since I've started treating everyone differently. It feels better." Alex stopped and turned back to face Harris. "That's good to hear," he said, genuinely pleased. "It's all about the small changes. The way we work together, the way we support each other. It builds something bigger than just the job. And you've got a role in that, Harris. Don't underestimate it." Harris' expression softened. "I won't." And for the first time, Alex believed him. But it wasn't just about Harris anymore. It was about the entire department. Over the course of the next few weeks, Alex noticed more and more moments where the team was working in unison. They were no longer just a group of individuals doing their jobs. They were a group of people working toward the same goal. And it was making all the difference. But even with all the improvements, Alex knew that they weren't quite there yet. There were still issues to tackle, misunderstandings to clear up, and tensions to ease. However, the foundation was solid. Trust had been built, and respect had been earned, not just from Alex's position of power, but from the way people had treated one another along the way. One afternoon, as Alex sat at his desk, he received an email notification. It was a team report on a project they had been working on for months. When he opened it, he was met with positive feedback from all the departments involved. They had hit every deadline. They had exceeded every expectation, and the project was ready for launch. As Alex read through the report, a sense of pride filled him. This wasn't just his achievement, it was the team's. Everyone had pulled together, and everyone had contributed. No one had felt left out, no one had been belittled, and no one had been judged. Alex sat back in his chair, reflecting on how far they had come. The officer who had once mocked him was now someone he respected. The department that had been fractured was now a strong, unified team. The journey had been unexpected, but it had brought with it lessons Alex would never forget. In that moment, Alex realized something important. Leadership wasn't about holding power over others. It was about creating an environment where people felt valued, respected, and supported. It was about inspiring change, not through fear, but through understanding and empathy. And with that realization, Alex knew he was on the right path, not just as a leader, but as a person. The future looked brighter than ever. The weeks turned into months, and the transformation within the department only grew stronger. The once fractured, tense group was now a well-oiled machine, working together seamlessly. Everyone seemed to understand their role, but more importantly, they all respected each other. The early days of Alex's leadership were behind him, but the lessons learned during those times shaped everything that followed. Alex had settled into his new role with a sense of confidence and purpose. His initial doubts and nervousness had faded, replaced by a deep understanding of what it truly meant to lead. But as he stood in front of the department one afternoon, preparing for a meeting, he couldn't help but think back to where it all began. He thought about that night when he had encountered Officer Harris, how unfairly he had been treated, how small and insignificant he had felt, the way Harris had mocked him, the arrogance in his tone. But in the months that followed, Alex had seen Harris change in ways he hadn't expected. He had seen him learn humility, admit his mistakes, and genuinely become a better person. And Alex had learned something too. He had learned that leadership wasn't about power or control. It was about setting an example, being compassionate, and earning respect through action. As the meeting began, Alex noticed something new. Harris was standing by the door, waiting to greet everyone with a warm smile. He was no longer the officer who had sneered at Alex. He had become an active participant in the team, helping to lead and guide others. And it wasn't just Harris. Everyone in the department had stepped up in their own way. Alex had created an environment where everyone felt empowered, and in turn, the team had exceeded every expectation. After the meeting, As the team filtered out, Harris approached Alex, a confident, genuine smile on his face. "We're doing great, aren't we?" he said, his voice filled with quiet pride. Alex nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "We are. You've come a long way, Harris. And so has the whole team." Harris chuckled. "Yeah, but I couldn't have done it without you, boss." Alex's expression softened. "It's not about me. It's about all of us. We've created something special here, together." The conversation shifted to a more lighthearted topic, but Alex couldn't shake the feeling of accomplishment that lingered in the air. He had gone from a young man who had been humiliated to a leader who had transformed an entire department. And Harris, the officer who had once mocked him, had become a symbol of that transformation. The change was real, and it was lasting. As the day drew to a close, Alex walked through the office, taking a moment to look around. The office, once filled with tension and animosity, was now full of laughter and collaboration. People were chatting, sharing ideas, and working together on projects. The respect that had once been a distant goal was now part of the fabric of their daily lives. Alex stood by the window, looking out over the city, reflecting on how far they had all come. The power dynamics had shifted, but it wasn't about that anymore. It was about mutual respect, personal growth, and the way they had come together as a team. Alex had found his place, not just as a leader, but as someone who had helped others grow along the way. He couldn't help but smile to himself. It had been a long, difficult journey, but it had been worth it. The officer who had once belittled him was now someone he could count on, and the department that had once felt like an impossible challenge had become a thriving, unified team. In that moment, Alex realized something that had been true all along. People could change. They could grow, learn, and rise above their mistakes. And sometimes, the most powerful change happened when you least expected it. With that thought, Alex turned away from the window, ready to continue the work ahead. His journey had come full circle, but it wasn't the end, it was just the beginning.